I'd like to begin today by opening our Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. The Bibles are in the pew in front of you, and if you're in the very front row, the Bibles are underneath the pew. And I'd ask you to turn to page 808, Matthew chapter 2. I'd like to pick up the text beginning in verse 13. In verse 13, you can imagine that the wise men have left the house. Mary and Joseph have been moved from the manger into the house, still in Bethlehem. The wise men have left, and night falls. And imagine for a moment if you're Joseph. This house is now filled with these foreign fragrances of frankincense and myrrh. He probably held that gold wondering, what am I going to do with all this gold? The gold has probably been hidden in a dark corner of the house. And now he crawls into bed and tries to get some sleep. But Joseph's mind is probably still swirling. Why would God choose me? Why would God choose her? Why would God bring the shepherds here? Why would God bring the wise men here? And with all of these questions swirling in his mind, he finally falls asleep until the angel arrives. Now, you remember in Matthew chapter 1, Joseph can't catch a lick of sleep. The angel wakes him up in Matthew 1, and now the angel wakes him up again in Matthew chapter 2. And what does the angel say? He's just fallen to sleep, and the angel says, "Rise, get up. Take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt." Have you ever been on a journey? Have you ever been on a trip, and while on that trip, there's a part of you that just longs to go home again? You've been on a vacation, and the vacation's been nice, but you just want to go home. And we don't know how long Joseph and Mary have now been in Bethlehem, but you remember Luke chapter 2, right? Caesar Augustus had declared that there should be a census taken, and so Joseph and Mary have to go back to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem. That was a 70-mile journey from one place to the next. And now they've been there in Bethlehem for a while, and now the angel of the Lord says, now you got to go to Egypt. And if you and I are Joseph, we might begin to argue in our heart, Egypt, that's the wrong way, God. I'd rather go home to Nazareth. I've got my business there. I've got work piling up. There are people who are waiting for the projects to be completed. I want to go home. I don't want to go to Egypt. And it's another nearly 100 miles from Bethlehem to Egypt just to get to the edge. We don't even know how deep into Egypt this young family traveled. But if you're familiar with Matthew 1, and I suspect you probably are, you saw an obedience out of Joseph that you will now see once again. Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there. And look at what verse 14 says. And so Joseph rose, tired as he probably was, shook Mary awake and said, it's time to go. Fetch the frankincense, gather the gold. We've got to head to Egypt. And so they departed. They went to Egypt, and they remained there. Now let's turn our attention to this other fella named Herod for a moment. Herod was not a good guy. When Herod discovers that he's been tricked by the wise men, Herod throws a full-on temper tantrum. Herod, this grown man, throws a 3-year-old hissy fit. And he overreaches. Because when we're behaving that way, oftentimes we don't make the wisest of decisions. We don't even make good decisions at times. And so this grown man throwing this hissy fit, he gathers his soldiers. He brings them in and he says, because I don't want to lose my power, because I don't want this baby to obtain my throne, he calls for the death of all of these 2-year-old boys. 2-year-old boys and younger. Today, she's not here today, but today is officially the Sunday that Deb Schrank hates the most. Our preschool director, every time she and I talk about this Sunday, she just says, and then is that terrible reading where Herod does that nasty thing to all of those little boys. It's a heart-wrenching account. But I do want to put the account, this true story, into proper perspective. I was adopted. I was born in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was adopted, lived in foster care for a little while, was adopted, but before I got to live in the thriving metropolis of Farmington, Missouri, for the first 3 years of my life, I lived in a small little place called Knob Lick, Missouri. Now I'm going to repeat that. I lived in Knob Lick, Missouri. Now, if you look at a map of Missouri, Knob Lick is the smallest speck they can possibly find to put on a map. That's Knob Lick. Bethlehem was the Knob Lick of that region. And so the truth is, even though Herod sent the soldiers to take the life of all these little boys, it probably only affected a handful of families. But yet I don't mean to minimize it. One family, one boy is far too tragic of a story. I'd like to take a moment and simply compare the two men that we've met in today's reading. We've met Joseph, and now we've met Herod. Quite different men, aren't they? Let's think of Joseph for just a moment. Obedient, humble, heart turned toward God. Herod, mean, murderous, nasty, heart turned away from God. Which are you more like? I already know that answer. Church, I know I'm preaching to the choir. Which of the two are you more like? I know the answer is Joseph, but unless you're perfect, and maybe some of you are, but unless you're perfect, there's a little bit of Herod in each and every one of us. There's a little bit of hissy fit in each and every one of you. And there's more hissy fit in me than you. Is your heart turned toward God in obedience? Or is your heart turned away from God, demanding your way? Well, here's the good news, church. Because there's a little bit of Herod in each and every one of us, guess what God did? God sent a heart surgeon into our midst. God sent a heart surgeon from heaven to be born of a virgin. And this heart surgeon, instead of using a scalpel or a tray full of shiny instruments, here's what this heart surgeon does. This heart surgeon uses his scriptures as his tools for healing. It looks like this. Whenever that Herod in you creeps up, whenever that hissy fit begins to grow, you know what Jesus does? Jesus longs to heal our heart with his word. Time spent in his word brings healing. Here's a point that I'd like for you to consider as we look at this point. The health of our heart will always affect our actions. Think of that. The health of our heart will always affect our actions. Whether we're more like Joseph or whether we're more like Herod, the health of our heart will always affect our actions. And if you're ever wondering what the health of your heart is, you don't even have to go to a heart doctor. If you're ever wondering what the status of your heart is, this is all you have to do. Watch your actions. Look at your actions, and that will tell you whether your heart is healthy or whether you need a little bit of work done. And so now I'd like to draw our attention back to Matthew 2. Herod has now passed. Herod has now died, and lo and behold, look at verse 19. Herod's died, and an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. You thought you slept bad. Joseph must have bags under his eyes like this world has never seen. Joseph is once again sleeping. The angel shows up. You think Joseph ever said, "You again?" And then look at that very first word that the angel says to him, "Get up, rise." No more sleep, no more slumber. It's time to go. Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. So now he's traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem, from Bethlehem to Egypt. We don't know how long he's been in Egypt. Herod died in 4 AD, and now from Egypt up to the land of Israel. But now look at this. And he rose, this, by the way, is obedience. Joseph rose, he took the child and his mother, and he went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Why? If you read a few commentaries, you'll quickly discover it. And what I'm about to say is going to sound strange to you. Archelaus was a worse cat than his dad. We've heard what Herod has done, and commentaries tell us that Archelaus was even worse than his dad. And so Joseph and Mary and Jesus, they arrive in the land of Israel, and they realize that Archelaus is doing some nasty stuff. And then look at what the text says. And being warned in a dream, Joseph withdrew to the district of Galilee. And Joseph and Mary and Jesus, all the way from conception to birth, this tiny little family of 3 have gone full circle and have now returned to Nazareth. By the way, there were 3 different fulfilled prophecies here in this text. This last one declares that his son would be called a Nazarene. And this is why they've returned home to Nazareth. And so the last thought that I'd like to remind you again, leave with you again today, is that one about Joseph and Herod. Which are you more like? I get it, Joseph. You're more like Joseph, obedient and humble. But when that little Herod creeps up, could be today, could be this week, could be in 2020 at some time, no doubt. There's a cure for that little Herod in each and every one of us. That cure was sent from heaven to be born in a manger. And by the way, John 1, do you remember what John 1 says? In the beginning was the Word. And that Word was with God. That Word was God. And God, the Son, He longs to use that Word to heal our hearts. I should also mention that Herod tried to kill Jesus, right? You know that wasn't the only time that people tried to kill Jesus. You know that, right? In Luke chapter 4, Jesus was preaching in his own hometown, and the crowd, they wanted to drive Jesus to the edge of the cliff, and they wanted to throw Jesus off the cliff. You remember what he did? He walked right through the midst of them. Bad guys 0, Jesus 2. Jesus is undefeated. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, but Pastor, we all know that Jesus died. That's true, but he wasn't killed. The book of Matthew says that when Jesus hung there on the cross, he yielded his spirit. He gave up his spirit. Jesus never lost. And Jesus' death is our death. Jesus' resurrection is our resurrection. Jesus' undefeated victories are our undefeated victories. And because of that winning record in Jesus, we can be like Joseph and live obediently and submit to his heart surgery. What would 2020 look like if our hearts were changed by Jesus?